This episode is dedicated by Time Ghost Army Brigadier Drew Hardin to his grandfather, Donald Wilson Round, and all those who flew the B-26 Marauder bomber. More on that later. June 8th, 1945. Remember 6 months ago when the American Pacific Fleet sailed into a typhoon? You remember that? Yeah. Well, this week, it happens again. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, in spite of devastating Allied bombing campaigns, Japan's high command again vowed to fight to the bitter end. They were inspired by the long and tenacious defense of Okinawa, though by now, their forces there have withdrawn to a very small area at the very southern tip of the island. The US was considering several options to win the war with Japan's unconditional surrender, and a new option is a super weapon they've developed, an atomic bomb, though it has yet to be tested to see if it even works. There were changes in both American and Japanese naval command, and an American mission to Moscow to ensure that the Soviets will soon join the war against Japan, now last man standing for the Axis powers. The second to last man standing was Germany, who surrendered a month ago. This week, on June 5th, the Allied Control Commission meets for the first time in Berlin, announcing that they are the new government of occupied Germany. This is also when Karl Dönnitz's Flensburg government is officially dissolved, though its members were rounded up 2 weeks ago. The Allies set up the European Advisory Commission in October 1943 at the Moscow Conference, and confirmed it at Tehran a few weeks later. See, they anticipated already then the defeat of the Axis powers, and the EAC was to make recommendations for post-war politics in those countries. The ACC members for Germany are the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Decisions can only be made by consensus. German territory is now back to what it was December 31st, 1937, minus what's been given to Poland and the USSR. And each of the four nations has its own sector of occupation. This week in the Pacific, the Americans are really trying to occupy the final sector of Okinawa. On the 4th, 2 regiments of 6th Marine Division land on Oroku Peninsula to outflank the Japanese defense lines. Many Japanese have in fact retreated here from Shuri, so this will be a tough fight. Here, Naha Airfield is defended by the Japanese naval base force of 5,000 that I mentioned last week. The 6th Marine Division is blocked from moving south by Naha Harbor, hence the amphibious landing by the 4th and 29th Marines. On the 8th, the Americans attack fortified positions on Yuza Hill and Kunishi Ridge. Napalm is pretty much the only thing that can dislodge, or more accurately destroy, the enemy here. The Japanese determination to fight back led to an enormous number of casualties among the Marines. On average, an American rifleman could expect to fight for only about 3 weeks before becoming a casualty. In many frontline companies, every soldier was wounded, and their replacements then wounded in their turn. Some replacements were killed before they could fire a single round. But really, the rest of the forces are coming up and consolidating this week for what the attackers hope will be the final assault next week. There is still fighting on the Philippines too. The Japanese are still holding out in several places there. I haven't mentioned the island of Negros in a while, not since the Americans eliminated the main enemy position there on Dolan Hill. The battle was not over though, and US 40th Division has been combing the island to take out each and every Japanese position. That's not nearly over yet, and this week on the 4th, Japanese Commander Takeshi Kono disperses his forces all over the island, and it is up to the US 503rd Regiment, together with local Filipino forces, to clear the island from now on. The 25th and 32nd Divisions have been fighting the Shobo Group on Luzon for nearly 2 months now, and they've taken serious casualties. Total battle and non-battle casualties for the two divisions are over 15,000, which is the strength of a full division. The Japanese committed just over 20,000 men against them as fighting frontline troops, but 13,500 of those have been killed by now. The Japanese have, in fact, lost nearly 400,000 men total in the fight for the Philippines. And the American battle and non-battle casualties there are around 150,000 total at this point. 25th and 32nd Divisions do not get a rest now either. They, and 6th, 33rd, and 37th, will continue to surround and compress the enemy in the mountains of Luzon, north of Santa Fe, and northeast of Baguio. U.S. 6th Army Commander Walter Kruger's staff estimates there are only around 23,000 Japanese troops left here. There are nearly 70,000 of them in actuality. So a campaign began the last day of last week, June 1st, by 25th Division to clear the way down Route 5 heading north. 37th Division follows them and then passes through them into the Cagayan Valley, both fighting and scouting. Bambang falls to the attackers on the 7th. 6th Division is following them and is to head northwest to Central Cordillera. This will allow 25th Division, hopefully by the end of the month, to finally leave the lines and prepare for attacking Japan later this year. 32nd Division will go to join 33rd at Baguio. This will all take time, more so now since the summer rains have arrived, raining as much as 25 centimeters a day, which makes moving troops, and especially supplying troops, painfully slow. Both the Americans and the Japanese have setbacks at sea this week. In the Java Sea on the 8th, British submarine Trenchant sinks Japanese cruiser Ashigara after Ashigara evacuates 1,200 troops from Batavia. Ashigara has a destroyer escort on her voyage, and Trenchant is on the hunt together with submarine Stygian. Trenchant and the destroyer, called Kamikaze, have a skirmish in the morning, but lose contact. Kamikaze then heads north and engages Stygian, while Trenchant spots Ashigara and fires 8 torpedoes. Ashigara tries to turn and comb the torpedo tracks, turning into them to present a smaller target, but she is hit 5 times and sinks at 12:39. 1,253 troops and crew are rescued by Kamikaze and 2 local ships. 1,300 go down. As for the Americans, Bull Halsey took command of the fleet again last week, and he has some real trouble now. Remember 6 months ago when he led the 3rd Fleet into a typhoon? Well, he does it again this week. Okay, as June begins, there are signs that a typhoon is building near the Palaos, and on the 4th, the reports say it's heading for the waters east of Okinawa, which is where the fleet is, although you can't predict a typhoon's path with true accuracy. Well, the carrier planes are all grounded and secured with multiple lashings, and the destroyers refueled. Halsey talks with the meteorologists and then sends his 2 task groups heading east-southeast, which should put them well in the clear. But new reports say the storm is now heading more to the north and is going faster. So Halsey changes course to the northwest to try and cross ahead of the storm in a big semicircle. But the typhoon doesn't play ball, and it crashes into the fleet. Jocko Clark's Task Group 38.1 gets the worst of it early June 5th. Pretty much the entire group takes a real beating, though no ships are actually lost. All 4 carriers report damage, though. The corners on the flight decks of Hornet and Bennington actually fold over like dog-earing a book. 30-some meters of heavy cruiser Pittsburgh's bow is just torn off. 233 planes from the carriers are swept overboard despite being lashed down. 36 more are wrecked beyond repair, and 23 more just badly damaged. 6 men are lost at sea. And since, again, this is Halsey's 2nd typhoon in 6 months, there may be repercussions for him. We shall see next week. I said last week that I would talk this week about the plans for the Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands, and now I will. The overall plan is Operation Downfall and is scheduled to begin November 1st. It has multiple parts. Operation Olympic is to use Okinawa as a staging area to capture the southern third of Kyushu. Operation Coronet is to go off in early 1946 and is to attack the Kanto Plain near Tokyo on Honshu. This is to be backed with air power from captured air bases on Kyushu. Who is going to do this, which, if it goes off, will be the largest amphibious operation in history? Units redeploying from Europe are not expected to partake until 1946. So replacements from home in the States will fill out the assault forces for Olympic, which are the forces that are already in the theater fighting. Kruger's 6th Army is to run Olympic with a total of from 14 to 17 divisions, including 3 Marine ones. Their plan is to take Kagoshima-1 Bay and Ariake-1 to use as ports of entry, and then drive north and take the southern third of Kyushu. Then they would develop that as a staging ground for Coronet with local airfields and all. Walter Eichelberger's 8th Army will run Coronet, backed by 10th Army, made up of divisions redeployed from Europe, ideally taking the whole Tokyo-Yokohama area first, and then spreading out onto the Kanto Plain and basically just expanding until Japan surrenders. This will all begin with 14 divisions, 2 of them armored, and then 10 more coming in as reserves. Douglas MacArthur's May 28th draft says Olympic will involve 776,700 personnel and Coronet 1,026,000. Now, we have a special that's just come out about the redeployment issues and the draft issues involved in getting millions of men to this theater, so I won't go into it here. But U.S. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall's prediction about a general lessening of enthusiasm for the war post-Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, is coming true. Congress is calling for the discharge of coal miners and the exemption of agricultural workers from the draft. Business leaders are also becoming more and more critical of the Army and what they see as its obstruction to reconversion from a full war economy. Cuts in orders were already creating unemployment. Unless the civilian economy picked up the slack, there would be mass unemployment. It is not going too far to say that by VE Day, the Army was becoming the prime target for frustration and anger. It was coming to represent a war of which the Americans were tiring. There is the simple fact that the War Army had to reconfigure industry to get enough resources to make weapons and armor and stuff like that to fight the war, but it also had to withhold things from the individual, food and fuel and other stuff that had to be rationed so the rest could go to the guys doing the actual fighting. But through April and May, the constraints on industry have been lessening, and the market economy is coming back. The government is canceling contracts for stuff they no longer need produced for the war. What stuff is that, you ask? Well, with the war in Europe over and the Japanese Navy a thing of the past, they don't need any more new ships. And they don't really need any more new planes either. But a lot of the individual stuff is still in force. Sugar and butter rationing will remain as it is. More meat will be allowed, but won't reach earlier levels until near the end of the year. Coal supplies will be reduced, but gas rations doubled, though new tire supplies are not that far from halved. Cotton, especially, is in short supply. 1, because there hasn't been so much planting because of labor shortages, and 2, because the Army needs cotton uniforms and tents for the Pacific. These figures, by the way, are from Implacable Foes. Great book. Fred Vinson, who is the director of the Office of Economic Stabilization, is also director of the Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion, OWMR, and he predicts that war production might go down maybe 15%, sure, but on the other hand, that'll mean more consumer items like radios or vacuum cleaners. Yeah, that'll mean a modest increase in unemployment, but that's only going to be workers who are temporarily out of work. Well, in May, the Army Air Forces canceled contracts for 17,000 planes, which is expected to cause job losses of 450,000 people. That's spread out over the next year, but still. And a lot of people in Congress, well, a lot of people in the U.S., find it hard to swallow that the armed forces will need 11 million men and women still in uniform this year and maybe next year, and all consuming more personal supplies than they did when the U.S. was fighting a two-front war. Barron's Magazine writes that the Pentagon's plans envisage, as has been said of all military plans, anything up to an invasion of the moon. But that's because they can't see that the staging zones in the Pacific are a mess. You gotta send all these people these hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people to place before the invasion. But where can you send them in such numbers? Manila is a wreck, as is the whole central valley of Luzon. Where can you deploy 2 million people, or 5, or 7? As the minutes of an OWMR meeting note, the transfer to the Pacific is like sending the entire population of Philadelphia to the Philippines, but it can only proceed at the speed with which people can be received, not sent. On May 25th, George Marshall met with the House Appropriations Committee. He said that if the Soviets joined the war, then yes, the U.S. would probably need fewer troops. But who knows if they really will? Asked about the strategy of bombardment and blockade, Marshall identified the numerous problems with that approach, including the cost to taxpayers of a prolonged campaign. He also noted the Americans needed to consider how the Chinese would feel about the continued presence of Japanese troops in their country, and warned that the occupation of strongpoints from which to launch an effective blockade could result in a costly war of attrition with casualties approximating those expected from a direct assault. This meeting was a closed session, but there were those present who leaked its contents to the press, who promptly seized on the Soviet angle as if it were a settled thing, which it actually became a few days later. If you watched last week's episode, you'll know. Memorial Day was May 30th, and President Harry Truman gave his message to the people of his country on June 1st. The big majority of it was about the end of the war in Europe, but he then went into redeployment and figures for the Pacific. He said the Army would need just under 7 million men for the campaign. So 1,300,000 men, with high points under the new system, which I went over a couple weeks ago, will be released from service this year. And another 700,000 or so will also leave because of age or illness or wounds taken. So that's 2 million discharged in the next year or so. He then goes on to talk about what lies ahead. And while it's a warning to the Japanese, it's also a big shot at his critics in Congress and within his administration. He cited the casualty figures from the ongoing battle for Okinawa to paint a grim picture of the struggle ahead. As American forces advanced, they would face the bulk of the Japanese army for the first time. There would be no easy road to victory. Bombardment and blockade would not suffice. Infantrymen backed by tanks, artillery, and flamethrowers would have to defeat an entrenched and fanatical Japanese army on the ground. The supplies required for that job would be staggeringly vast, as would the distances they would have to travel to reach the war zone. The home front would need to produce fewer tanks, planes, and artillery pieces, but munitions output would nearly match that of 1944. He points out that they do have to produce a load of stuff specifically for the war over there. Anti-malarial drugs, combat boots, cotton uniforms, amphibious trucks, radios, raincoats. This means that things like leather and textiles will remain limited at home, as will food, since they have to feed the 7 million man army, and also the newly liberated or occupied parts of Europe. Have to feed them too. Truman closes by exhorting the country to continue the fight until Japan's unconditional surrender. They hope that our desire to see our soldiers and sailors home again, and the temptation to return to the comforts and profits of peace, will force us to settle for some compromise short of unconditional surrender. They should know better. They should realize that this nation, now at the peak of its military strength, will not relax, will not weaken in its purpose. There, I will end this week of the war. A week of hits to the Japanese and American navies, Okinawa getting ever closer to its conclusion, more fighting in the Philippines, plans for the invasion of Japan, and plans to move millions of men halfway across the world to do that invasion. Marshall and American Secretary of War Henry Stimson have a pretty complex plan to beat Japan, and it unfortunately involves the government continuing to impose on the civilian economy and continuing to command millions of young men at a time when the country is expecting relief from both. As I said the other week, their big worry is any large-scale public unwillingness to continue to sacrifice for the war effort would encourage Japan to hold out and eventually maybe force the U.S. to accept a negotiated peace, an incomplete victory. So they, and Truman, feel they must show Japan that the U.S. is fully committed to invading the Japanese home islands with an army of 7 million men and creating the devastation that only such a giant army and its unlimited firepower can create. As I said earlier, this episode was dedicated by Time Ghost Army Brigadier Drew Hardin to his grandfather, Donald Wilson Round, and all those who, like him, flew the B-26 Marauder in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Donald's war began in Sardinia in the summer of 1943, a deployment which required a 12-day journey across 3 continents in the Marauder. Donald then flew 64 missions in the B-26 from January 15, 1944. Some of his earliest strikes were in support of the Anzio landings that month. Other sorties included missions to Florence, Rome, Pisa, and Elba. While living on Sardinia, Donald built a house with some other officers and ate plenty of good food. Oh, and he decided that Mark Clark was incompetent and should have been relieved. Drew wanted us to mention that specifically. Donald survived all those missions unscathed. Although his plane was hit by flak a couple times, he saw another B-26 blow up in front of him, and he lost several friends. Later in life, he chalked up his survival to luck. He'd just been in the right places at the right time. But the B-26 should take a lot of the credit. When the bomber entered service at the end of 1940, it suffered several accidents caused by a high takeoff speed and a collapsing landing gear. Pretty soon, people were calling it the Flying Coffin and Widowmaker. Still, it proved to be an excellent combat aircraft and had the lowest loss rate of any American bomber. It was fast, carried a heavy bomb load, and could take punishment. Later in life, whenever Donald spoke to Drew about the war, the topic would invariably turn to the B-26. I'll finish by reading some of Drew's words. When people speak of the people who built America, they are referring to men like him. He flew 64 missions and went home to his new bride. They raised 4 daughters in a small house in Garland, Texas. He drove a Greyhound bus until he retired. Later in life, he was the general contractor on his next house. In his 60s, he was out camping with boys and men a quarter his age. In the end, the war was just a small part of a rich and long life. To me, he will always be the man who could do anything. If you would like to memorialize an episode of this series, you can do so by joining the Time Ghost Army at brigadier level for 1 year or by making a one-time donation. You can join the Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Do not forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.